Jesus. Some of you think of Jesus, the greatest of all time. When I think of the greatest of all time, I think of growing up, Michael Jordan. I like basketball, and I remember Michael Jordan just being incredibly insane with how good he was. I mean, watching him play basketball was like a man playing with boys, right? I mean, he could do anything. He could run the floor and it just dominate the game. Now today, many would argue that, and we see it play out all the time, many would argue that LeBron James is the greatest of all time, right? That he could do the same thing. And honestly, if you watch him play, like there's times where I would say, man, it's like watching a man play with boys. How many of you would think that Michael Jordan was the greatest of all time? How many of you, LeBron James, you're like, no. How many of you just don't care? That's most of us in the room. The greatest of all time. Jesus was asked this question. Jesus was asked this question of, what is the greatest thing you could focus on in life? Right? That Jesus was gaining in popularity. There was masses of people who would follow him. He always had a crowd around him. And because of that, the Pharisees, the teachers, the religious people of the time didn't like it. They were jealous, they were nervous, they were scared of the attention he was getting, and so they were constantly on the lookout for an opportunity to defame him, to catch him in kind of like something that would maybe be taught wrong. They were trying to trick him constantly. And so they came to Jesus one day and they said, hey, what is the greatest of all the commandments, all of the laws that have ever been taught, that have ever been passed down by our community of faith? What is the greatest? And this is what we read in Matthew chapter 22, verse 37 through 39. Jesus responds with this. He says, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And what do you think it means to love God in this way? When we say love God with all of your mind and with all of your heart and with all of your soul, what do you think loving God in that way means? Any ideas? Shout it out at me. Nothing. You're like, I don't know, dude. No clue. Be kind, all right? Serve others. Love God with all of your mind. It's to say, God, I want to give you my thoughts. I want to honor you with the way that I think about myself. I want to honor you with the way that I think about others. I want to honor you with every thought that I have. God, I want to love you with my soul. With the very depths of who I am, I want to offer that to you. I want to love you with my soul. God, I want to love you with all of my heart. It's essentially saying that, God, I care deeply about the things that you care about. Right? God, I love you with all of my heart means that, God, I want to have a heart like your heart. I want to love like you do. And the second is love your neighbor as yourself. Who is your neighbor? Any ideas? Just throw it out there. Who's your neighbor? Everyone. Right? So Jesus is saying, like, love other people as you love yourself. So love God, love self, love others. When Jesus spoke of the greatest commandment, he talked about what he is for. When Jesus was communicating and teaching and talking about what the greatest commandment is, he's essentially saying to all of us today what he is for. This is what I'm about. This is what I care deeply about. This is what I long for you to be a part of. He's inviting us into this relationship, and he's saying, I care about you. Christians have communicated to the world all the things. Let me know if you can agree with this. You don't have to, shout out anything. But Christians have communicated to the world all the things that God is against. Right? We see it all around us, that we're constantly communicating to the world all the things that God doesn't like or God hates. And tonight we're not talking about, I don't have an interest in having the conversation of the things that God is against. This way of thinking is cultivated from our culture. It's the culture we find ourselves, that we live in. We grow up seeing the world and life through this lens, don't we? That we're taught to take sides, to draw a line in the sand, to take a stand for the things that we're for and to take a stand for the things that we're against. It's just the culture we live in. And don't get me wrong, there are things we should be against, right? It's okay to be against certain things like slavery. Like modern day slavery is there's more slavery happening today than there ever has been ever. Like we should be against that. We should be against bullying and mistreating people in schools, right? We should be against that type. We should be against any kind of crime. We should be against like the idea that eating too many calories will make me gain weight, right? Like I just like cupcakes too much. And it sucks that like you eat too many of them and then I gain weight actually pretty easily, so it's kind of unfortunate. Because I would love to just eat pizza all the time. Right? And so I'm against that. I'm against that idea that calories are not good sometimes. How many of you have ever felt that God is against you? Or at least doesn't seem to be all that interested in your circumstances right now? How many of you believe or think or are wrestling with the idea that maybe God is against you, or that at least he doesn't seem all that interested in what is happening in your life right now? You don't have to raise your hand, but maybe you can relate to that. And I know growing up for me, that was something I wrestled with. I was taught in the church that I went to that God was waiting and ready to pounce on me. That the moment I was to mess up or do something wrong or say something dumb or whatever it may be, like God was ready to punish me. And that's what I was taught to believe. I remember growing up with this idea that God was against me, that there's no way he was for me because he was so interested in just laying down the law, right? Just like ready to jump all over it and to punish me. I remember even being in my early 20s and I was working at a church in Ohio. And I was asked by the pastor, he was going to be away for vacation. And he asked me, he said, "Hey, Aaron, could you speak on a Sunday morning and preach?" And I had never done this before, like aside from doing it in front of middle school students, because that's the group I worked with at that church. And so I was a bit nervous, but I said, "Sure, let's go for it," right? And I was excited, but I was also had like an immense amount of anxiety, and I'm struggling through it. And I remember the night before, I was sitting on the couch, it was late at night, and I couldn't sleep. Like I remember the nerves, I remember just freaking out, but at the same time, I was really struggling. My wife came and she sat down next to me and she's like, "What's going on?" And I start talking about like, I'm just freaked out. But then in the midst of that conversation, I just started crying. And she's like, "What's wrong with you?" I don't know if I had cried in front of her at that point yet, because we were just married about a year. I said, I think that God wants me to fail. And I really believed that. Like, I really wrestled with it. I said, I think God was going to cause me to fail because he wants to teach me a lesson because I've done dumb things before. And I was ready for him and waiting for him to just punish me. I don't believe that anymore. But I can relate to the idea that maybe some of you may wrestle with the idea that God is against you. However, we're not here to discuss the things that we may think God is against, but to lean into the idea that God is for you. And he's for you, and he's for me. Let's unpack this idea of what it looks like for God to be for us. In the book of John, we find Jesus in another circumstance where people are trying to get him. Right? The religious leaders are struggling with all of the attention he's getting, and they're struggling with the things that he's teaching and the way he's behaving, and so they're trying to trap him again. And so John chapter 8, we have this story that plays out, starting in verse 1. It says, "But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, and at dawn he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him." So imagine, picture this. You have the masses and they're all around him. They're gathering. They're waiting for something to be taught. He sat down and he began to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. Okay, so first of all, ew. Right? Like, were they peeping through the window? I mean, come on. So she's caught in the act of having sex with someone she should have been, right? And so she's caught, and then they take her and they bring her to Jesus and they throw her out in the middle of this crowd. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. And in the law of Moses, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" So again, they're looking to trap him. And they were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to draw in the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you." Jesus declared, "Go now and leave your life of sin." And so you have this moment where all of these people are standing and she's been exposed and she feels shame, and it's this awful scene, and they're looking to just trap Jesus. Like, she is a pawn in their little game. And the law says to do this. The law says to kill her. And so what do you say we do, Jesus? And Jesus begins to draw on the sand, which is fascinating. But the bottom line is he says, "For those of you that have never done anything wrong before, go ahead, throw a stone." And not one of them could. And then he goes and he leans into her and he says what? He says that I won't condemn you, that you're forgiven, that you may now go and leave your life of sin. That his hope was for her to first experience love and compassion and grace and mercy. But then he drew her in and he says, "But leave this life that you're living now." That life could look different. You could experience different things if you could turn from this way. See, God is for us even when we screw up. Even when it means creating tension with those who think otherwise. Jesus was risking a lot. And if you ever get a chance to study the bigger picture of Jesus, if you ever get a chance to study the teachings of Jesus, like if you are at all curious to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the story of Jesus, and you can look at all the different interactions that he had with people and the religious leaders, and you look at all these little interactions and the things that he talked about and how he behaved, there's something you'll notice, that Jesus rarely responded with what he was against. And people wanted to know what Jesus thought about certain groups of people. And people wanted to know what Jesus thought about different ethnicity groups, and different genders. People wanted to know what Jesus thought about certain groups of people who are very old or very young, or who had power or none at all, who come from different religious backgrounds or who come from no religious background. People were very interested to know the things that Jesus thought about groups of people that made different behavioral choices or bad behavioral choices. People were very interested to know what Jesus thought about people who had maybe nothing good to offer anyone. Because people cared. There was something happening. When Jesus was walking the earth, there was something happening, and people were getting excited about it. Because he was beginning to share a snapshot, a picture of who God really is. And if you study those interactions, all those interactions with all those different people groups, there's something else you'll notice. That most of Jesus' controversy revolved around the people he loved. Most of the controversy that surrounded Jesus in all of those interactions and how he behaved was revolved around people he loved and was for. People didn't like the fact that he was for all these different people groups. Because when you love someone, you are there for them. You are for them. You are for them. When you love someone, you are for them. It doesn't mean you are for all their choices, that you condone the behavior, but it means you want them to win. You want what's best for them. Still, people lost their minds when Jesus ate with sinners. People lost their minds when Jesus spent time and embraced the outcasts and loved people who were rejected by every religious group, every religious person. Jesus' message for changed the world. And when you see what Jesus was for, when you see what Jesus was for, and you hear what Jesus said is the greatest commandment we could have followed, the greatest thing that we could do, the greatest thing that we could shape our lives around, when we see those things play out in the stories of Jesus' greatest message was for us to lean into this idea that God is for you. God is not an against God. And to him, the greatest thing about us is what we're for. So it's this idea, and you'll see it on the screen, that if God is for me, then I am for others. That if God is for me, then I am for other people in my life. When you've been convinced for a long time that God is against you, or you've been convinced that God is more for you than anyone else, I want you to simply respond to Jesus' message by doing one small thing. Pay attention to who you are for. So the next time you're interacting with people at school, or you hear something on the radio or the news, or I shouldn't say that, the next time you see a different post about something, right, then I want you to pay attention for those that you're for. And I also want you to pay attention to those that you're against. And so often when we hear about someone who did something and we know that maybe we're not a fan of the thing that they did, oftentimes we find ourselves making a case against them. Right? We have some kind of judgment. We look at them a certain way. The lens that we're looking through oftentimes is jaded, and we form this opinion. But I want you just to pay attention to that. A person in your school and something that they've done that maybe was bad. Have you found yourself in a place where maybe you formed an opinion, or you find yourself in a place where you're against who they are? A group of people and what they represent. The next time you hear about a group of people and what they represent, pay attention. Are you for them or are you against them? Maybe someone who's wronged you in some sort of way, pay attention. Are you for them or have you built a case against them because they've done this thing that you don't appreciate? And I know that's a challenge. It's not a simple thing I'm asking, but all I'm asking you to do is become aware of it. Just become aware of how you respond to the things that we observe about people. Are we for them or are we against them? Because if God is for me, then I am for others. When Jesus spoke of the greatest commandment, he talked about what he is for. You know, when the religious leaders came and they pressed in on him and they wanted to challenge him, they asked him, what is the greatest thing? What is the greatest law of them all? Jesus could have just listed a whole bunch of things that you could do, or that you shouldn't do, or that you should do. He could have just had a long list of these are all the things that you need to do in your life in order to become more pleasing in the eye of God. But he doesn't. He just simply says, I want you to love. I want you to love me with all that you have. I want you to care about the things that I care about. I want you to love me with your heart. I want you to love me with your soul, down deep, the core of who you are. I want you to love me with your mind. And I want you to love people like you love yourself. Like he says, there's no list of things that I want you to do. I just want you to love. And the question we have tonight that we need to wrestle with is, what does it look like for me to be for people even though we don't agree with the way they live their life? Right? Maybe they've done something to you or to someone else. What does it mean for me? What does it look like for you and I to be for them? Maybe some of you in this room you're still not convinced that God is for you. I want you to ask yourself, how would it change my approach to God if I truly believed that he is first and foremost for you. If you're someone in this room that is still wrestling with the idea that God is for you, how would it shape your view of who he is if for just a moment you could truly believe that he is for you? How would it change your perspective? And if you find yourself as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, wondering who you should be against, I want you to imagine, even just for a second, what it would look like for you to be for that person. I want you to imagine just for a moment, what would it look like for you to be for that person that's so hard to love and to care about? What would it look like for you to want that person or that people group? What would it look like for you to want them to win? I want you to wrestle with these two questions tonight. But first, what I'd like for you to do is I'd like for you to close your eyes. I want you to spend a moment resting. And I want you to picture this person or this group of people that you've formed an opinion about. That at some point in your life, maybe recently, you've made the stand that I am against them for whatever they've done or however they are. And the question for you is, how would it change the way you interact with them if you were for them? How would it change the way that you talk to them? How would it change the way you see them if you wanted them to win in life? And for those of you in the room that are still struggling with this idea that God is for you, and maybe you're still wrestling with the idea that you still are clinging to the idea that God is against you, for whatever reason that may be, I want to ask you to, in this moment, ask God, God, could you show me how and why you are for me? Could you reveal to me the reason? Could you reveal to me your heart for me? We're going to sing a couple more songs, but I encourage you to continue to wrestle through these two questions. Let me pray. Dear God, thank you so much for this night. We thank you for this group of people that you love. God, I pray that as we wrestle with the idea of you being for us, and how does that motivate us, and how does that shape us, and how does that rearrange the way we see ourselves, and rearrange the way we see the world, and even how we see our relationship with you. God, I pray that you would reveal yourself to us, that you would encourage us to be a people that would care about the world, even in the midst of tension and disagreements, that we would cling to the idea that we long to be for others, that our actions would follow, and we would find ways to show people all around us, regardless of who they are and what they've done and where they find themselves, that we would look for ways to show them we care.